Dan Haberly from the University of Sussex, and today I'm going to be talking about a project called the Atlas of Offshore FDI. So FDI is often considered to be the backbone of globalization. There's a whole industry that's built around studying it. And the idea is this is supposed to be the real part of globalization. So this is actual physical facilities, this is mergers and acquisitions, this is what creates employment and transfers technologies. The thing is, when you actually map out even the official FDI data, this is what you see. You see interesting things here like being able to fit Germany and France inside of Luxembourg simultaneously, or the People's Republic of China inside the British Virgin Islands. And actually, it turns out if you just add up the money, about 2/3 of the FDI reported by the IMF is going in and or out of places where it's more likely than not to be linked to shell companies. All right, so this is important for two reasons. Firstly, it shows you can't think of these issues of tax avoidance and offshore structures as some peripheral thing happening around the edges of globalization. This actually now seems to be, this is now the main event actually in terms of global capital flows. The second thing that's a bit terrifying is it implies that we really don't know what the world economy actually looks like. So there's some data sets that go a bit beyond this, but for the most part, this huge peach part of the figure is sort of a black hole. We don't really know what this money is actually doing. All right, so these are the issues that have motivated this Atlas of Offshore FDI project. So it's a collaboration between Global Studies and the International Center for Tax and Development at Sussex, with help from the Tax Justice Network, and graphical work by Density Design in Milan, and collaborators at KCL and Leeds. All right, so there's two key components of this. The first part is creating a new database of FDI. So I'll explain what this 4D database means, but essentially it's trying to figure out who the pink money in that figure actually belongs to and where it comes from. So it's basically integrating multiple data sets together to see, once we combine these, how much information can we get about this. Or another key part is figuring out, even when we put this information together, how much can we not sort of possibly know under present conditions. The second part, the idea is, well, we have to actually show this, communicate people somehow. So the second component is going to be an interactive online data mapper. And sort of a key motivation behind this is this idea that we can't just think about this anecdotally. We have to really show people the massive systemic nature of these issues. All right, so today I'm mostly going to talk about the first component, this database. This is a new type of FDI database. Until very recently, essentially all we had were bilateral FDI databases. It basically tells you where the FDI in a country is immediately coming from. If it's coming from an offshore jurisdiction, you don't have any idea where it's coming from beyond that. For most places, this is still all that we have. There's a couple countries now that have gone beyond this to report what they call ultimate FDI. But the problem is it's still bilateral. It doesn't cross-disaggregate based on immediate point of entry. Another problem is only available for a few countries. And finally, it turns out this is not really ultimate FDI. This is where the parent company is based, which it turns out more often than not, you just dead end at another offshore jurisdiction. So if an American company inverts to Ireland, then Ireland would be reported as the ultimate investor in these databases. All right, so for the Atlas, what we've done is added a fourth dimension, so what we call real ultimate nationality to data. This is the hard part. This involves basically manually classifying the actual nationality of about 6,500 offshore companies in Orbis. But what you get is this four-dimensional matrix where you can cross-disaggregate these offshore FDI flows at all of these different levels back to sort of the real ultimate parentage. All right, so I don't have much time, so I won't talk in detail about methodologies, but it's based on what we call a triangulation approach. So it's using, essentially running large number of Monte Carlo simulations of what the FDI matrix structure could be based on estimates from Orbis with constraints imposed by the known data set. What's nice about this is you get, for when it adds up to the correct FDI totals, which Orbis doesn't do, but you get more sort of geographic detail than the official data. Also, by combining these, you're able to get an idea of how reliable these estimates are, so it sort of benchmarks itself. All right, so what do these results look like? So the database has been constructed for 9 major developed and developing countries. They encompass more, this is more than half of the entire world economy. Basically most of the blue in this figure. So I'll start out by talking about the BRIC countries, which are the 4 big developing countries in the database. we really haven't known a whole lot about where the FDI in these places is coming from because so much of it goes through offshore jurisdictions. This is what I think it actually looks like when you go through the layer of immediate point of entry into the BRIC economies and look at where the real ultimate nationality of FDI is coming from. All right, so the first thing you notice, there's an awful lot of looping in this figure. So this is round tripping where people and companies control domestic assets in their home country through offshore structures. So this is enormous. The current estimates, about 3/4 of the offshore FDI in Russia is round tripping. For China, I have a number of 60%, although I think actually these are probably biased towards the low side. The real figure is probably a bit higher than this even. Huge amounts of money. Actually, just the estimated round tripping component for China alone is almost as big as the value of all offshore investment in the United States. So over $1 trillion is the estimate for this. And actually, when you count round tripping, the estimate is that China actually accounts for a somewhat higher component of the total offshore FDI than the United States, at least in these 9 countries. So vast amounts of money associated with this. So you can go down, this is a macro database, but you go down to the micro level, you can learn a bit about what this actually is. For Russia, essentially, this is oligarchs. So fairly small list of names account for most of this. China, interestingly, at least based on Orbis data, it seems to be mostly state-owned enterprises. So it's a bit of a paradox, it's a bit counterintuitive, but most of this seems to be related to these overseas, so red chip listings, so Hong Kong, New York Stock Exchange, state-owned companies raising capital. So what it means is when you look at this American FDI component coming in, you also have to imagine this other component of portfolio investment that this round tripping is picking up and then basically taking back into China, largely being incorporated into the state-owned sector. It turns out, though, America is not the biggest source of offshore money in China. Taiwan seems to be far and away the largest. Big band of uncertainty here, but it's estimating maybe $100 or $200 billion of offshore Taiwanese money in mainland China. It makes a big difference. So according to the official statistics, this is $29 billion. That would be 6% of Taiwan's GDP. The estimates here say that Taiwan may have invested anywhere between 1/4 and half of their GDP in the mainland once you take into account these offshore flows. All right, so finally you have Brazil and India. Interestingly, they don't really look like each other or like Russia or China. India seems to be sort of roughly equal parts American and round-trip offshore money. In Brazil, you actually don't really see much round-tripping. It's a sort of interesting anomaly. All right, so those are the big developing countries in the sample. So next I'll show the developed countries. So the US, UK, France, Germany, and Italy are the ones that have been mapped out. So here's what I think this FDI network looks like once you pierce through these offshore structures. The first thing you notice is it actually looks a lot like the developing countries. Huge amount of looping, round-tripping going on. You know, it's especially big flows for the United States. Turns out for the US, almost all of this round-tripping is corporate inversions. So about 2/3 of it going through Ireland. Actually, I think about 10% of all FDI in the US is probably from these corporate inversions. Interestingly, second place seems to be the United Kingdom after Ireland. It seems to be most of the money once you subtract Ireland out of this. In terms of round trip, and you notice most of it is going through one specific pathway. So invert to Ireland, go back into the US through Luxembourg. Actually seems to be mostly US pharmaceutical companies accounting for maybe $100 billion or so of this. In terms of round-tripping intensity, though, if you look as a percent of FDI, Italy seems to be higher, right behind Russia and China. Interestingly, though, as a percent of GDP, so impact on the economy, the UK is actually estimated to be in 3rd place, right behind China and Russia. Jersey seems to be the biggest component of this, so the UK's own dependencies. Another thing about the UK, you can estimate how much money is actually coming from countries as opposed to what reported. You notice this is difference in orders of magnitude in terms of what's coming through offshore structure versus directly. Another thing this database allows you to do that you couldn't do before is you can estimate what percentage of a country's total investment is going through offshore jurisdictions. So it's not time to talk about this map in detail, but you notice a lot of it is red and orange, so 60 to 100% of the investment going through offshore channels. And so I've started to also explore various determinants of this. It's interesting because the first thing you notice, So I've used CPI corruption as a sort of proxy for general institutional variables. You don't really see a big north-south divide or sort of institutional divide. On the other hand, it seems to be specific factors. So communist history clearly has a huge impact, massive 50% increase, but also these historical variables. So like whether it was part of the British Empire, and things like regional diaspora networks seem to be very important. All right, so what does it all mean? So in terms of implications, the first thing I think you have to say, this is now increasingly a bipolar system when we look at the offshore world as a whole. China and the United States sort of have joint dominance within this system, although geographically for different reasons. China, it's essentially round-tripping. US, it's a mixture of round-tripping and investment in other countries. Another big thing that stands out is you don't see a sort of clear north-south divide in these patterns like you might expect in terms of overall level or things like round-tripping. Clearly there's different motivations for this going on, but you see a convergent evolution in terms of structure. What does seem to impact it are things like communist history and then these specific sort of relational historical layering factors. Another thing that really stands out is this special relationship of the UK with the offshore world. So the UK administers all of these offshore dependencies, but also what this exercise highlights, the UK itself is now a very important tax haven for things like US corporate inversions or round-tripping in general for other countries. But also the UK is exceptionally highly impacted compared to other countries by things like round-tripping, especially from its own dependencies. The final point I think that stands out, so this is a macro analysis, but when you actually look at the micro data, what you see is the micro and macro sort of collapse. So it turns out there's a pretty small list of names that accounts for these aggregate flows, which I think in terms of policy underscores the importance of sort of country by country reporting and actually making this information public at the individual actor level. All right, so just to end by quickly showing, so again, this is going to be in a publicly available database, so this online mapper, you'll be able to basically select combinations of conduits, allow people to visualize the structure, it'll link to various sort of information about this. So this will be online soon. All right, thank you.